Hi guys. So let's go over this section of our book, The Settlers, Miners, and Indians. We know that in 1859, when miners first arrived, everything was very peaceful between these groups of people. In fact, the miners and the Plains Indians were trading with each other. You know, they probably were meeting at a place called Bent's Fort, one of many places, and Bent's Fort is a very famous place in the Eastern Plains. It is right there, and it was a trading post and a place where people who were traveling in that area would stop, kind of make a pit stop, restock supplies, let their horses or their animals rest or exchange them for fresh horses or animals, do some trading, and then continue on their journey. So there was lots of trading happening during this time between the Plains Indians and the miners and maybe even the settlers during this time. So it was very peaceful to start off with. About 5 years later, in 1864, things started to change. The army was in this area and there were a lot of conflicts between the Plains Indians and the army. It resulted in, Apache Indians attacking ranchers and villagers. We learned about a rancher, his wife and his kids being killed. We learned about stagecoaches being kind of attacked, wagons. So think about those wagons that are coming from the East Coast and making their way to supply towns or mining towns. Those are coming under attack. It was a very scary time for a lot of different people. And fearing an attack, the people of Denver became panicked. And I want to remind you guys that Colorado was still not a state yet, but we were a territory. And a territory is kind of one of the last steps to becoming a state. And you need lots of things to happen in order to become a state. Of course, one of the things is to have people, to have a bustling kind of community and money coming in and people being here. And so John Evans, who was the governor of our territory at that time, had to make some quick decisions because his people were panicked and he wanted this area to become a state. And you can't really have a state if people aren't willing to live here. So his decision was to say to the Plains people, if you are peaceful, we want you to go to a place in the Plains called Fort Lyon. You're going to set up camp there, and if you go there, we know you're peaceful. We're going to leave you alone. Everything is fine. If you don't go there and we kind of find you sort of maybe roaming the plains or in villages or attacking, we're going to come at you. We're going to find you. We're going to assume that you're hostile and we're going to take care of that. So lots of Plains people did exactly what he asked because there were a lot of people who were peaceful. They just wanted to live their life and do the things that they'd been doing. So they went to Fort Lyon. They set up camp near the Sand Creek River, and they thought everything was fine. John Evans put a colonel named John Shivington in kind of control of this operation. And one morning in November, John Shivington took his army. They went out to the plains. They went to a place near the Sand Creek kind of river, and there was a camp set up. And they attacked that camp, which is what you guys looked at on Tuesday when you were looking at that picture. So let me show you this map again. Bent's Fort is right here. Sand Creek Massacre, the picture that you were looking at on Tuesday is right there where that X is. So remember, this camp, Sand Creek Massacre, this camp is full of peaceful Plains Indians. These are all men, women, and children who said, in response to the governor's request, we are peaceful. We're going to do exactly as you say. We're going to go to this camp. We're going to be kept out of it, and we're going to live our lives. Colonel Shivington, for whatever reason, disobeyed those orders by his governor and attacked this peaceful camp. So what you guys were looking at was Colonel Shivington and his army kind of making their way through the camp. And I'm sure you saw weapons kind of in here, maybe weapons, along with the Plains people. And they kind of ambushed them. They surprised them that morning. I can't even imagine these Plains people waking up to this, being completely shocked, blindsided by this. But that is what happened. And we learned that not only were there men in this camp, but there were women and children in there as well. So it was probably a horrifying experience for all involved. Yeah, you guys did a great job with your I sees, I think, and I wonders on Tuesday. And as I was going over some of your answers, I noticed a lot of you had noticed, I know you can't see it very well, but right there where my finger is pointing is the United States flag. So these peaceful people are flying the US flag in their camp. And I know a couple of you noticed that right beneath that, right there, is that small kind of white square. And it is a flag. So my question to you is, what do you know about waving a white flag? What does that mean when you do that? What's it a symbol of? And if you said it's a symbol of peace, of, I surrender, I'm come in peace, then that's exactly it. So not only were they flying the American flag, but they were flying a flag that said we are peaceful. So there were many signs that these people were not part of that hostile group. But despite that, Colonel Shivington made this choice to attack this group of people. Side note that he did go to trial for this. He was not supposed to do this at all and did go to trial. I believe he was convicted of a crime. We also learned that because of the Sand Creek Massacre and this attack on these peaceful Indians, there was an Indian war. They were mad. There was a war between the Indians and the army that went on for 3 years. Towns and villages around in the surrounding areas were attacked and some were burned down because of all of this. And eventually, the Plains Indians agreed to leave Colorado. And that's kind of how the war ended. And what they agreed to was they agreed to leave Colorado and move to reservations in Kansas and Oklahoma. And I'm sad that the book doesn't really talk much about reservations. And I'm going to include a link to a website that gives you some more information with pictures and things like that if you're interested. But a reservation is kind of a land that is designated for these Plains Indians. So they left their home to move to a totally different area and were kind of given land and saying, this is now your land. There's a lot more to that, but I will let you guys do some research and kind of make your own conclusions about reservations as you read them. So not only was there conflict between these miners and settlers and the Plains people, but we also read that there were some, maybe not conflicts, but some things going on with the miners and the Ute Indians. And we know that the Ute Indians live in the mountains. And of course, who else is living and working in the mountains during this time? Well, miners, of course, right? So the miners had their eyes on the Utes' land because it was rich with ore and they wanted that ore. So eventually the Utes signed a treaty that said that they would leave this area and they would leave the Rocky Mountain area. The Rocky Mountains are that long strip of mountains that kind of go down the center of our state, north to south. And they agreed to leave that area and move to a reservation on the western slope in the San Juan Mountains. And so they were paid $60,000 to give up their claim to the Rocky Mountains and move to that new area. Eventually, the miners kind of moved from the Rocky Mountains and sort of migrated to those San Juan Mountains and started to discover that there was gold and silver in those mountains. So once again, the Ute Indians were asked to leave that area, and they again gave up their land and in return, they agreed to get $25,000 every year for having given up their land and giving up the gold and the stuff that was being mined out of those mountains. So as you can kind of already see, there were lots of interactions between miners and settlers and the Native American people that were living here on this land. And I really want you to think about technically there were kind of two groups of people. There were the Native Americans, whether they were the Plains or the Utes, and then there were the miners, the settlers, and the government. So two different groups of people. And I really want you to think about, putting yourself in the shoes of each of these groups of people and, really thinking about it from their perspective. You've got the Native American people who are, living on this land, and we know that they were here prior to miners and settlers arriving, and this was kind of their home. And now all of a sudden they have these people coming in and kind of using their land and sort of living alongside of them. And I'm sure that took some getting used to, and obviously there was some conflict involved in that. But then you also have, the side of the settlers and the miners trying to earn a living and to make their fortune and make a living for their family. You've got settlers who want to move to a new area and live in a new area in peace. And you've got the government who's trying to establish order and make sure that everybody is safe. So there are two very different sides going on here. So I really encourage you guys to look at both sides and see it through their eyes. Our chapter ended with us learning more about mining today. And we learned that mining still does happen here in Colorado, but it's very different than it was in the 1800s. We've got big mining companies and huge pits, and it's more of hard rock mining than it is placer mining. And if you do see anybody doing placer mining, it's more for a hobby and not necessarily that they're expecting to strike it rich. So mining still does happen. There are huge mining companies that are still doing work, big machinery, and we still see the effects of mining. You can see, sides of mountains that have kind of been bulldozed, and maybe things aren't growing as much there because the earth has been disturbed. But one thing I will say, and the book doesn't talk about very much either, is that nowadays there is a huge emphasis on when a mining company leaves or when they're finished mining, there are groups of people whose job it is to make sure that that land is restored as much as it can be to what it was before they started mining there. Because think about how much the land gets disturbed when you have to mine. You're blowing things up, you're digging things, you're taking away vegetation, you're disturbing the animals, the wildlife that's living on that land. So there is a huge emphasis to restore the land and the earth and to make sure that it's livable and it's things can live off of it and it's not completely useless anymore. One of the last things we learned about was that these mining towns, while some are ghost towns, some of the bigger towns are still being used for other purposes. Cripple Creek and Central City and Black Hawk were all huge mining towns in the 1800s. They don't necessarily mine as much as they do anymore, if at all, but now they've turned into casinos. They are places to go to gamble. So they are still getting a revenue and income in, just not through mining anymore. Aspen, Breckenridge, and Telluride were all huge mining towns in the 1800s and no longer mining, but they are known for things like skiing. Those are destinations for great skiing nowadays. And even places like Georgetown, Leadville, which are all, again, great places to mine. They don't do as much mining anymore, but they are great places for tourists. They give tours, Jeep tours. They have museums that tell their history. So these places are still around. They're still places that you can visit nowadays. And they're still part of our history. All right, so that was the end of our chapter, and my next video is going to talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing the next 2 days.